Hi guys! Buying second-hand lenses can be a minefield, and even a professional photographer can get caught out with a bad lens. So what are my top 10 things to look for when you go ahead and either buy your second-hand lens either online or in person? In this episode of Photography 101. And I'm going to start right now. What is up guys, Photo Fever here and welcome back to the channel. So buying second-hand lenses is an incredible investment. I must say you can save an enormous amount of money over brand new lenses simply because they are second-hand. For instance, take this lens here, the 11 to 24mm. This is a £3,000 lens, but I was able to get it for just under £1,500, almost half price, simply because it is second-hand. But is it worth the money? And what are the things to look for so you guys don't end up with a bad lens and a bad investment that you're going to have to get fixed in the end run? So these are my top 10 things to look for when it comes to either buying a second-hand lens online or in person. Now I should make it clear that not all of the items I'm about to point out are factors that will damn right render the lens useless. But what I am saying is it should play a part in the pricing of the lens. Just because this lens doesn't score a 10 out of 10 doesn't mean you shouldn't buy it, but it does mean that you're not going to be paying an arm and a leg. And a slightly damaged or worn lens could actually be a better investment because you're getting better value for money. So it's a balancing act between the actual quality of the lens and the price itself. So the first thing I usually check whenever I pick up a second-hand lens is go ahead and just simply take the front cap off and check the front element. Usually if a lens has ever been misused or damaged, usually the front element tells the story. Any gouges, scratches or any very minute dust on the front is usually incredibly noticeable as soon as you take the front cap off. Now it doesn't mean that all scratches will render the lens useless. It really depends on where the scratches are on the front element. If they're directly in the middle, I would probably stay away because it's going to show up in the images and it will affect image quality. But if it's on the edges, near the top, bottom, left or right, it might not necessarily show up. So do bear in mind the position of where the scratch is could play a bigger part in the performance of the lens than the actual scratch itself. So do make sure to have a look at where it is, and I would actually take a few test shots at very, very small apertures like f/22 to see if any of the scratches appear. Maybe on a blank surface like a paper, that might show up, especially with scratches or dust on the front element. So after you've checked the front element, the next thing I check is the actual barrel of the lens. Make sure there's no deep gouges or any impact damage, especially near the front or the sides. If anyone's dropped a lens before, especially a lens that's so front heavy as this one, usually it's going to fall face down. So if you are going to see any damages, it's probably going to be either around the lens hood or possibly around near the focus or zoom ring. So do have a look and make sure there's no any deep gouges. Again, most wear and tear you can kind of see, such as this lens here. Some of the buttons and some of the numbers have been worn away, but that's just to do with general wear and tear. But I wouldn't have brought this lens if it had a deep gouge or scratch on it because the likelihood it's been dropped, and I always stay away from lenses that have been dropped because you don't know the internal problems that the lens has. So number 3 on my list is something that a lot of people forget to look at, and that is the filter thread. You won't believe how many people I've seen that have cross-threaded their filters and pretty much rendered the thread useless, and you're not going to be able to actually put a filter on. And especially a lens like this is a 16 to 35mm. I use this for all of my landscape photos, and I recommend using a ND filter whenever you're doing landscape photos. But if the filter thread is unusable, you're not going to be able to do that. So do make sure you have a look at the filter thread. Either just simply buy a cheap filter, such as this UV one, and just try and fit it on. And if it works and it screws on, that is perfect. But if you're finding it's incredibly difficult to put on, the light hood is either been cross-threaded or someone's dropped the lens and it's actually damaged the actual filter thread itself. So please make sure to have a look at the filter thread. It is really important. So number 4 on my list is looking through the lens to see if there's any dust, fungus or mold. Best way to do that is to simply take the rear cap off and the front cap off and have a look at a very bright light source and then have a look through it at different levels. So you can go ahead, move it further away, move it closer, and you can actually see if throughout the entire lens, if there's any dust or mold. Now, most lenses, including this lens here, which is actually a brand new lens, has a small amount of dust. Dust is something that most lenses will suffer with, but mold and fungus is something you definitely want to stay away from. Now, the reason for this is it can spread. That's the main issue, really. If you own a lens that has fungus, and let's say you put it in a camera bag, it could spread to the rest of your lenses. And I work at a camera shop. We do not accept any lens that has fungus because it could spread to every single lens we own in the shop. It is very contagious. So please make sure that if you are buying a lens, do not buy a lens that has fungus in it. Now, it might be difficult to spot what fungus looks like, but here are a few photos of what fungus actually looks like. You can see it look like really, really small dots on the front element, and it looks like this kind of weird, kind of like tree looking, kind of root looking thing from the edges. So that's something to definitely look for, is because it could affect the rest of your lenses that you own, especially if you place this lens in a camera bag full of other lenses. It could spread to every single lens you own, and that is definitely a bad investment. Now, another thing that I see a lot of people miss is to check the weather sealing is intact. An easy way to work out if a lens has got weather sealing is it should have a weather sealing gasket on the back. On the back here, you can see it has a very small rubber ring. So what you want to do is to make sure that there isn't any chunks or scratches out of this, because that could affect the weather sealing of the lens. And you don't want to buy a lens that has weather sealing and actually has damaged weather sealing, because then it might get damaged when you go ahead and put it in the rain. So please make sure that the weather sealing gasket is nice and working. Make sure there's no chunks, or make sure it's not too dry, because otherwise it could crumble, especially with really old lenses from, let's say, the 80s or 90s. So make sure the weather sealing gasket is intact and in fully working order. And whilst you're looking at the back of the lens, make sure that the actual mount itself is fully working. Make sure that there is no large gouges or scratches. And make sure, I'm not sure if you can see all these really, really small pins here, you need to make sure that they are all working, because these pins are really important for image stabilization, but also the autofocus of the lens. I've seen a few where they're actually missing, rendering the autofocus of the lens useless. You can also see on the back of the lens how much the lens has been used. Usually if someone's really looked after their lenses, but they've actually used them a lot, you'll be able to see that by discoloration on the back of the mount. So make sure you have a close look at the mount, either bring a small magnifying glass, just to make sure that all the contacts are in fully working order. But another way to do that is to actually put it on a camera to see if it works. So after you've gone through all of those checks, the next thing I recommend doing is actually bringing a camera with you that the lens can connect to. So for instance, this is a Canon 16 to 35mm. So I have a Canon 6D Mark II here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and place it onto the camera, click it on, and just make sure that it actually communicates with the camera correctly. Again, if any of those pins are damaged, what it means is basically the camera has either can't read or use any of the information that the lens gives it. So the aperture might not necessarily work, the autofocus, or even the image stabilization might be disabled because of those contacts aren't necessarily contacted to the camera. So what I do is recommend turning it on, making sure it can autofocus throughout its entire focal range. Again, this has got a very small window on this lens, so I'd put my hand in front of it, click on the autofocus, and as you can see, it goes through the entire focal range. So do make sure that the actual autofocus works from its minimum to its maximum point. And whilst you're looking at the zoom and focus ring, making sure that it's actually nice and smooth when you go ahead and use it for manual focus. You won't believe how many people go ahead and test it, they see it all working, and then they get home and it's going because they didn't test the actual focus and zoom ring. So please make sure that it is completely, fully nice and smooth and it isn't gritty. I've seen a lot of people buy a lens and you won't believe how gritty it ends up coming because someone's left it on a beach or left it in their bag and it's got loads of sand in the bottom of it. So making sure that they're all nice and smooth and fully working. So once you've done all of those checks, the next thing I would recommend doing is just taking a few sample photos. I would also recommend testing it at different apertures. Now, because this lens is an f4, I'd recommend testing it at f4 and then at its lowest aperture, which is f22. I would also then have a look down the barrel to make sure that the actual aperture blades are working. You won't believe how many times I have seen an aperture blade actually miss a line, and it actually will show up in the photos, especially in the background bokeh. If you've ever taken a photo of a light, especially in bokeh, you'll probably see loads of these funny little artifacts, and that's the actual imperfections of the lens showing through. So make sure that the actual aperture works, and make sure that you've got a small button on the bottom of your lens, which is an aperture tester. So it actually shows you what the aperture when it's open and closed. Make sure there's opening and closing properly, and all of the blades are fully working. And last but not least is the image stabilization. Making sure the image stabilization works is key, especially with a lens that has image stabilization. Now, a lot of lenses these days don't. That's because most cameras do have image stabilization built in the form of IBIS. But for instance, this lens does have it. That's why I've put it at the end of this list. Now, please make sure it works. The best way to work that out is, I would say, look through, make it have handheld, place it into video or photography mode, and then turn it off and then turn it on again. And the best way to work out is by actually reviewing the footage to see if it's blurry, especially if you're using it for video and you're holding it handheld. You should notice a difference. Now, another thing to check is I would also turn it off and off while it's close to your ear. You should hear a very slight whirring sound, and that means it's fully working. Now, I've seen a lot of people actually bring a camera to me and think that the image stabilization is making too much noise, but actually it's actually fully working. So please make sure that the image stabilization is working, but it isn't making any odd noises. Any squeaking or clunking noises probably means the image stabilization is on its way out, and it's a lens that you want to stay away from. But if the lens is making ever so slightly whirring noises or small clicking noises, likelihood means that the image stabilization is in fully working order. Brilliant, and there we go guys. So these are the things that I look for when you go ahead and buy a second-hand lens. Now, it doesn't mean that if it has small scratches or it makes some ever so slight funny noises or it's a little bit stiff from the focus wheel, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't buy the lens, but it should impact the price of the lens. For instance, this lens here has quite a stiff focus ring, and I knew that going into the purchase. So I was able to actually delegate and reduce the price by a considerable amount. So do bear in mind that it doesn't mean the lens is completely useless and you should stay away from it, but it should impact the price when you do actually purchase a lens. A better lens will obviously cost a lot more. So you've got to work out your price point. Is it worth buying a lens that's ever so slightly scratched for £100 cheaper, or do you want to buy a lens that is best optically performing? It is completely up to you. And write down in the comments, guys, if you think I've missed anything. I must say there are a lot of things to look for, and the comment section is always the best place to look for when you are after advice. So I highly recommend, if you think I've missed anything, please make it right down in the description so no one makes a bad purchase when they go ahead and buy their second-hand lens. Again, guys, if you want to like, comment and subscribe to my channel, it really does help my channel grow. Also, guys, if you want to hit the bell notification so you don't miss any of my latest content. But until next time, guys, keep creating.